I'm here with Abe Aidelbaum, and he's with the management of the Krugerdorf Cemetery in just south of Kirkland Lake and north of Englehart, Ontario. And we're going to talk a bit about the significance of the cemetery and plans for its future. So, Abe, did you just want to give us a brief introduction of yourself and your history here in the Northern Ontario, the Northeastern Ontario?
I'm a long-term resident of Kirkland Lake. My parents came here in the 1930s during the Depression years, and the North was booming with the gold mines and copper mines. As a long-time resident, I eventually ended up inheriting the chore of or responsibility of continuing the operation of the Krugerdorf Cemetery. The current situation is that the Krugerdorf serves the communities from Englehart, Kirkland Lake north to Timmins, and at one time went over to the Rouen area in Quebec. As the Jewish population in Northern Ontario has declined over the years, the Krugerdorf management and internments have dropped accordingly. The long-term prospects of the continuation are going to be eventual financial strain to keep the property managed and active.
Okay. How did Krugerdorf get started?
The first internment in Krugerdorf was in 1905. At that time, the railroad was pushing its way north, and the story is that some workers were coming home on the river in a canoe after working on the railroad. Canoe capsized and one individual drowned. Jewish background, and consequently somebody by the name of Hembroff, what was the last name? Henarofsky, pardon me. Henarofsky was the name. Donated this piece of land for the first internment. And through the years, the land was formally transferred to the Krugerdorf group, and we're in our 112th year now.
Wow, 112 years. That's amazing. It's almost...
It's a page of history.
It's incredible. Now, the Aidelbaum family, tell me a little bit about how they settled in this area. You mentioned that they came during the Depression.
They came during the Depression years, 1932, I believe, in that 32, 33 time there. My father worked as a salesman in a furniture store,
right.
Then eventually started canvassing dry goods, and then opened a retail store, and continued on. The store actually was run by my late wife, and it closed in 1987. So we certainly had over 50 years of retailing
right.
in the Kirkland Lake area. I branched off into real estate and containerized tree growing, greenhouses, tree seedlings. So we were pretty diversified.
Right. Now, are your family members buried in Krugerdorf?
My mother, my father, and my wife are in Krugerdorf.
Okay. And is that one of the reasons why you became involved with the management, or is there?
Well, actually, my father-in-law was quite active in upgrading the property site, and he managed Krugerdorf for a number of years. When he passed away, my wife took over.
Yeah.
She ran it for quite a few years, and then after her death, I was sort of the last in line, and I ended up running it for the past, I guess, 20 years.
20 years. What's involved in running it from your perspective? I mean, it's not a historic cemetery by any means. It's still an active cemetery.
It's still active
cemetery. Yeah. So what's in your day-to-day role?
The maintenance is obviously during the summertime, where grounds, the grass has to be cut, and
Right.
the trimming around the headstones, minor maintenance work.
Yeah.
We have a chapel there that usually has required maintenance. Through the years, we've replaced the siding, put in vinyl windows, better doors. So there's general housekeeping between building and property.
Right. And then do you hire contractors to do the maintenance? You don't do it yourself.
We hire contractors to do the grass and the brush maintenance.
Yeah.
And if there's any tree cutting, we
Yeah.
hire people to do that.
Now,
If there's an excavation for an internment,
Right.
we've been able to hire a local contractor with
Okay.
excavation equipment to look after that. And then bases are poured, headstone
right.
is put into place.
Now, in this TVO video, talk about how difficult it is to have internments in the wintertime, and one of the people interviewed in the video said that they had to walk through 4 or 5 feet of snow. Is that still a problem, or do you actually, are you able to rent?
The last winter internment we had was Eddie Dukes, and that's the interview.
That's the fellow who said yes.
And we don't have 4 or 5 feet of snow here, but we do have snow drifts, so that has to be plowed.
Yeah.
And the site excavation, usually the ground is reasonable to work with underneath the snow.
Yeah.
It doesn't, what'd you say, freeze hard.
Right.
The building has electric heating in it, so we're able to have some sort of shelter for the funeral ceremony and internment rites that take place. Interesting thing has happened is that with some of these winter deaths, some families have allowed cremation, and while it is not orthodox to have Jewish bodies cremated,
Right.
we've actually had to move with the time and location, and we've changed our bylaws that we do allow cremation and internments. So we have had cases of winter deaths which have been interned in the spring.
In the springtime, right. So what are some of the challenges you're facing? We talked briefly about the Jewish population and how, like, as other populations in the north, is being reduced as people move out. So what are some of the challenges you're facing with administrating Krugerdorf?
The biggest challenge is trying to put in some system or fundraising in place that will replace the limited diminishing funds that we have now.
Okay. And any, have you developed any plans, or are you still looking into how this is going to be done?
Well, if there would be a way that we could turn the cemetery into a charitable organization that Revenue Canada would allow us to give charity receipts, it would be easier for us to get funds.
Right. And that is done. I mean, I know in Toronto, some of the cemeteries that some of my family are buried in they're called trusts.
Yes.
And they're very much
well, sometimes
nonprofit.
it's a synagogue or it can be a church.
Yeah.
And you can have some arrangement that allows you to issue a receipt and then transfer the funds over it to that. But the rules exist now. We cannot issue a tax deductible receipt.
Right. Okay. In terms of the Jewish population in northeastern Ontario, we talked briefly about this, and you made some references to the census figures. How many people in the Northeast today identify themselves as being Jewish?
I really have no idea. We have a question in Kirkland Lake here, having 100 families at one time.
Right.
We're down now to about 2 ladies, 2 widows. Myself a widower, and there's a young gentleman here that is here. So we're about about 4 households here.
4 households.
4 households. Right. I believe the Timmins area has somewhere between 10 and 15 families.
15, right. And the synagogue that was quite active in the Kirkland Lake area, that's been closed for 10, 15 years? Or
Longer than
that.
Longer.
70s, I would imagine.
It could very well be.
Timmins had its own synagogue until that time as well, I understand, in the same type of area. And I guess also Iroquois Falls. Iroquois Falls still has a Synagogue Avenue.
Synagogue Avenue, Synagogue Street, but I don't believe there's anybody Jewish
there anymore. I think what I read a couple of years ago was that there was a elderly woman who belonged to the Abramson.
Yes, I think that was in
the Abramson
Falls.
family.
Yeah. But the Nossoff family was very active in the Iroquois Falls, Ansonville area.
Right.
And they moved away years ago.
How does and I know we're moving a little bit away from Krugerdorf, but I still think it's somewhat related. In terms of services, do you have like a visiting rabbi that comes in every now and then, or?
No. Timmins on a few occasions had a rabbi come in for the high holidays, but I don't recall that taking place in the past 10 years.
Okay. Can you tell me just a little bit about some of the people in northeastern Ontario who were Jewish, who contributed to the development of this area? Eddie Duke and a few other people from the Kirkland Lake area. Did you, like the Bolkovetsky's, for example, in Timmins, did they have a store in Kirkland Lake as well? Or?
No. There's. I think you've got to just turn your pages back a bit here.
All right.
Let's go back to about the early 1900s, 1901, in that area there. Baron de Hirsch, a German industrialist and philanthropist, had this feeling that he wanted to move Jewish families out of the urban areas into more of the rural life that could take place. He sponsored family development groups in a number of places around the world, including the mid-Canada in the prairies. At that time, he had a Jewish group of 50 families that he sponsored that set up in a place called Krugerdorf as farmers. They were not experienced. Farming is not as advanced as it is today. They struggled and really had a hard time existing. At about 1905, 1906, this was the start of the gold mine discoveries and the cobalt mine discoveries. And these Jewish families realized that there was greater potential in these areas, entering either as merchants or other services, and consequently they abandoned the Krugerdorf establishment completely. And this is where the first internment that came through the railway. So there's a price of change. So the Jewish population ended up in professions, in teaching, in medicine, in law, in dentistry, and in other services.
Right. But there was one individual, Paul Penna, who founded Agnico Eagle in Cobalt, who was a very devout Jewish believer. And he actually made quite a living as a miner.
Yeah,
Paul Penna.
I don't know.
If you go to Cobalt, there's the Paul Penna.
I knew there were some people in mining equipment there and background there.
Yeah.
But when my father-in-law emigrated from Russia, he was sponsored by a relative, and one of his first jobs that he had was working in the silver mine in Cobalt.
Really, as a miner?
As a miner. Yeah,
it's quite something.
Yeah.
How big is the Krugerdorf Cemetery? I mean, how many people?
I think we have about 110 or 115 internments there.
What do you see as the legacy of the Jewish community in this?
Very active in having these areas develop.
Yeah.
It's one thing to have an industry like mining. It's another thing to have a supporting system of facilities
Right.
and other areas that contribute to a town, like
Right.
retail space for
Yeah.
one thing, medicine, legal things.
Yeah.
These are all things that are necessary to make a town function.
Right.
And I think the Jewish community have been more than active in supporting that.
And you have certainly people like the Bukovetsky family that had stores in Timmins, Kapuskasing, and a couple of other places. I'm not sure if North Bay was one of them, but you also have the Feldmans. I think the Feldmans are still in.
There's still a Feldman family.
Timmins there.
I don't think they're active in that Feldman store anymore.
But they're in that area.
They're still up there.
And the Steinberg and Mann, the clothing store.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if it's still owned by Steinbergs or.
Actually, Don Taylor is the son-in-law.
Oh, okay.
Of Marg and her husband that were founders in that store.
Right.
And I think Darren Taylor is operating the store there now. So that's a long history going back to that.
Yeah. Good. Is there anything else you want to add in terms of the challenges that Krugerdorf is facing, and also your next steps towards securing its future?
Well, the securing of the future is we have to have somebody that is going to have to take over the management of this when I pass on.
Right.
Hopefully somebody, Timmins is involved with us.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully we can recruit somebody from there.
Yeah.
And then at that point we're going to have some long-term financial support.
Right.
We either have to have a good sum of money, possibly a couple $100,000 invested, that would carry this on financially in perpetuity.
Mm-hmm.
Failing that, it would have to draw on a budget that could run between $3,000 and $4,000 a year to operate the place.
3,000 and 4,000?
Yeah.
Well, that's not that much to.
It's not that much, but it's where do you source it from?
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time and talking to me about this. I've walked around the cemetery a couple of times, and I think it's really a source of inspiration. I think sometimes when you come across something that's unique, that really is the focus and center of a bunch of people who settled in a fairly rugged area, cold winters, and people that have survived and sort of thrived through that. I think it's an inspirational site. So I hope that it continues forever. And,
we have a lot of visitors that come through every summer, some with Jewish backgrounds, some other mixed backgrounds that have interest in it as a historical site. So it certainly represents the pages of history of the North.
Yes, and it's been on CBC radio a number of times with a couple of reporters. So thank you very much. All the best, and I expect it to stay here forever. And and all the best of luck to you in your endeavors.
Thank you.